Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable in this wet July. It's lovely to have so many people with us. We've got the best part of 50 people in the room already, so fantastic to have so many people join us for what was, as Sue will attest to when we bring her in shortly, an intentionally contentious topic, but one that definitely needs talking about. And we haven't done a session on shared ownership for quite some time now on the roundtable, so I'm delighted that Sue could join us for today to bring it to the session. To those who I've not met before, to those who are new to the Social Housing Roundtable, my name is Matt Baird. I've been running the Social Housing Roundtable now for 3 and a bit years. Originally set up during COVID to help people kind of come together and discuss some key things that were happening at the time, and has now grown into this incredible community of over 900 people via various mailing lists. We've had more than 650 people sign up for sessions this year already. And we're getting busier and busier each week. And if you are new, this does take place every Tuesday at 11 o'clock. And we discuss anything and everything in the social housing world. They are all recorded. You will find details on our YouTubes and Spotify channel. And this year, I'm delighted to say we're being sponsored by Alertical. So massive thank you to them for their sponsorship and helping this run. The other way this runs is that day to day, I'm a recruiter in the housing world. I've been recruiting in housing for over 11 years and set up on my own just over 3 years ago. The money spent, whoever uses me for the recruitment, goes into making sure this does run for free for everyone. So if you can or are looking for any recruitment support, please do reach out. So on to today. Today, as I say, was an intentionally contentious topic. Sue and I have been looking to get a date in for a little while, so I'm really glad we're able to bring this to the table today. I think the topic around shared ownership is getting more and more grey, for want of a better term. There's lots of pros, there's a number of cons. We're going to try and kind of keep it balanced today. Some people have reached out to me and said, oh, which way is this conversation going to lean? And the truth is it'll lean whichever way you'd like to. I think too often we have discussions in the modern age where unfortunately what happens is people argue one side and then everything has to be an argument rather than a discussion. And the point in the roundtable is it is a discussion trying to give a shared and balanced view. So if you have got points you'd like to raise while Sue is doing her presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat. After that, we are going to have a good half an hour or more to really get everyone involved in a more open discussion. So we're looking forward to hearing you from you today. But for now, Sue, I will pass over to you. It's great that we reached out via LinkedIn. It's lovely to have been introduced and to have set this up today. And I'll pass over to you to introduce the topic and I guess the contentious area of shared ownership. So over to yourself.
Good. And can I check, can you see my slide at the moment?
Can't see it at the moment, no.
Can't see it at the moment. Let me just go back in and reshare it. Apologies for this.
No problem at all. Touchwood will load up any second.
The mistake of
It worked in the practice. There we are, we're working now. That's brilliant.
Okay, let's just get that out of the way. Okay, well, thank you to everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules for today's roundtable discussion. In the light of recently published tenant satisfaction measures and also a recent critical report on shared ownership from a cross-party group of MPs, I'm going to pose the question, is shared ownership a good idea gone bad? I'm going to kick things off with a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to try and keep it to around 20 minutes. Honestly, that's not long enough. So in some regard, I'm sure this will come across as unnuanced or oversimplified. We need much longer than 20 minutes, even just to cover the issues. But, you know, hopefully we can pick up the nuances in the discussion after this presentation. So I'm going to run through the good, the bad and the ugly, dissatisfaction, whether too many shared owners are trapped in the tenure. I'm going to look at legal complexity because I think this is hugely important to the discussion. I'm going to look at policy confusion and mission creep. And I'm going to ask the question, what next under a new Labour government? So, the good, the bad and the ugly. I mean, we've touched on the question of will this be a balanced discussion? And I really hope so. However, I'm not going to focus on the good outcomes in this presentation. We haven't got that much time. And the housing sector has numerous award ceremonies, other events, marketing case studies that all celebrate the success stories. So you know about the success stories. But the flip side, when it goes wrong, tends to get less attention. So that's what I'm going to focus on in my presentation. Now, clearly shared ownership works for some shared owners. Nobody would dispute that. But when it goes wrong, it can go very badly wrong. So starting off with satisfaction or dissatisfaction. Now, I haven't cherry-picked these particular screenshots. I Googled the first three housing associations that came into my mind. Actually, to be fair, I Googled four. I Googled my own housing association first, and I couldn't find their TSM results. So maybe they're there and I just couldn't find them. But the next three housing associations that I Googled were Peabody, L&Q and Clarion, the big names. Peabody report overall shared owner satisfaction of 26.6%, L&Q 31%, and Clarion 37.3%. Now, to put that in context, Housemark report that average overall shared owner satisfaction is 57%, but it's 33% in London, which obviously suggests better outcomes typically outside London. But it is of concern given quite how many shared ownership homes are in London. And per Savills, just under a quarter of shared ownership homes are in London, and a further 23% are concentrated in the southeast, near to London. I've also put an arrow pointing to the blank results. I can't help noting what data isn't collected, and I can't help wondering how shared owner tenant satisfaction would look if shared owners were asked about their satisfaction with service charges and estate charges for repairs and maintenance. We don't know, but the question isn't asked, and I think that's notable. Now, shared ownership is being described as a great product, and some may question the validity of the tenant satisfaction measures. So I just want to take a quick closer look. First of all, you've got the London effect. Londoners are known to be more dissatisfied generally. They're dissatisfied with everything, housing included. And there's a lot of speculation as to why that might be. You've got the cost of living in London, you've got overcrowding, there's all kinds of noise around satisfaction in London. So we need to take that into account. There's the fact that large landlords tend to report lower satisfaction than smaller landlords. And smaller landlords who might have high satisfaction aren't required to submit their results to the regulatory social housing. And there'll be all kinds of other factors that you could look at. But even so, average overall 33% shared owner satisfaction in London and 57% in outside London, or generally, including London, should raise a lot of questions. And that's what I'm really doing in this presentation. I'm raising questions about what sits underneath those results. Just to go back to the stats again, consolidated stats are problematic, of course. They disguise the specifics. What's going on here? And inside these overall stats, we need to better understand who is shared ownership working for and who isn't it working for. Is it working for people in flats or in houses, people in urban areas, people in rural areas, obviously not in London, but what about other urban conurbations? Does it depend on the nature of the local property markets and the local private rental sector? That's an area where Savills has done some work. Maybe we'll come back to that in the discussion. You've also got a huge range of households within shared ownership. So hypothetically, you could have an individual earning just under 90,000 as their salary coming into shared ownership in London, or 80,000 outside London. At the other end of the scale, you could have a household who maybe has come out of a relationship breakdown, the family home has been sold, one of the partners have got the children, they can't afford another family home, but they've got some cash from the sale of the previous family home. They buy a 25% share or a 10% share outright, and they're reliant on benefits for the rent and some other housing costs. Very different situations and a whole range of scenarios in between. Out of all those scenarios, who does it work best for? Who doesn't it work for? There's an important question about whether satisfaction declines over time, perhaps as risks crystallise. And again, this is something Housemark have reported on in previous years before the current stats. And I think it's a question we need to come back to. There's a lot of focus on access, on completions, but what happens over time? What are the long-term outcomes and impact? And how do satisfaction ratings reflect that? What's missing from tenant satisfaction measures? I've already talked about, well, just to mention in passing, satisfaction with service charges and affordability. There's also not a tenant satisfaction measure on shared ownership as a foot on the ladder. And again, I think that's a significant omission in terms of our understanding of satisfaction. So exploring dissatisfaction, I'm going to take the Select Committee's inquiry into shared ownership as a starting point here. So the committee looked at barriers to achieving full home ownership, and they looked at whether shared ownership is genuinely an affordable route to owning a home. There were over 100 written submissions to the inquiry from shared owners, I think something like 103. It's quite a small sample, but at the same time, research has been published with similar sample sizes. So I think there are insights in those submissions. We're not saying that it's a, it's a, what do you call it, sort of a balanced sample or what have you, but there are insights in there about what is going wrong, important insights. And I'd recommend taking a look at those written submissions if you haven't already. So of the written submissions to the inquiry from shared owners, around half weren't published because people were concerned about confidentiality, anonymity, but around 50 or so were published, and they shed some light on the issues. And what the committee found when it looked at those submissions was that for far too many people, shared ownership becomes what they described as an unbearable reality, where a blizzard of charges and repair costs mean they're unable to progress to full home ownership. And they recommended the government take clear and urgent action. And of course, at this point, we have to recognise the committee's been disbanded, the government's no longer in power. But even so, there are useful insights in that inquiry and that report. For me, one of the things that was most striking was the sheer number of times the word trapped was used. It was used a lot by shared owners, but also the National Sales Group, a legal firm, the Homeowners Alliance also used the word trapped in discussing shared ownership. And affordability is a key issue here. At the outset of the scheme, those inflation plus annual rent reviews were intended as a nudge to encourage people to staircase to 100%. But the policy is problematic if you can't afford to staircase to 100%. And of course, you've got the issue of 100% liability for repairs and maintenance, which is arguably more problematic under the new model, where you may have as little as a 10% share in equity. And I'm going to quote from one of the respondents to the committee, because I think this summarises some of the key issues that shared owners face. So this is a Clarion shared owner, and I mean, that's sort of public knowledge per the committee's website, but obviously these problems aren't limited to Clarion. I'm not pointing a finger at Clarion here. So, given the requirements of shared ownership, we were all forced to purchase the proportion of the property at the top of what we could afford. We agreed to this as shared ownership was the only way we could afford our own homes. But there's no room for manoeuvre in our finances. So these increases put us at risk financially. A neighbour who is also a shared owner resident is trying to sell their property. The most recent prospective buyer's mortgage has been declined because the service charge is too high. It seems we are trapped in properties that we cannot afford and will be unable to sell due to the high service charge. Now, I'm not going to go into the previous government's response in detail because they're not in power, but I just want to emphasise that their response was weak and disappointing, and it's a shame there hasn't been any opportunity for the committee as it was to dig a bit deeper into that. Before we move on to the policy and political context, I want to take a brief look at the law on shared ownership, the problems it causes, and why caveat emptor is a common but unreasonable response to problems. So let's start with the recently passed Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act. During debates in the House of Lords, some Lords raised a number of concerns regarding shared ownership. Lord Young of Cookham suggested that there was a risk that shared owners would fall between the cracks between conventional leaseholders and people who rent. Lord Bailey of Paddington, who has some understanding of shared ownership. Lord Bailey is a former shared owner himself, and as some of you, possibly all of you will remember, he advocated strongly for shared ownership when he was running for Mayor of London. But he proposed an amendment to the draft bill, requesting that the Secretary of State present a report to Parliament on proposals to ensure a fairer deal for shared owners. And he put forward a couple of ideas as to what a fairer deal might constitute, although he went to pains not to be prescriptive in that regard. Now, for me, the legislative process for the Act threw a spotlight on the absence of advocacy for shared owners' best interests. I was quite honestly shocked when I realised that not a single social housing sector organisation gave either written or oral evidence to the Public Bill Committee scrutinising the draft bill, despite the significance of short leases and lease extension for shared owners. not the National Housing Federation, not the Chartered Institute of Housing, not the G15, not a single housing association. And I think this says something about the relationship between the sector and shared owners and the attention paid to long-term outcomes and impact. Now, we all know that the Act was rushed and is flawed because it was passed during wash-up following the announcements of a general election. It's unclear whether shared owners will benefit to the same degree as long leaseholders, but it seems likely that they won't, and that particularly that there will be problems where the housing association isn't the freeholder, and that could be the case in more than 50% of shared ownership homes. Perhaps people here will be able to speak to those stats. Now, the RICS have flagged up some concerns in this regard. They point out that we still need further reforms so that shared owners get the same degree of rights under the new Act as a standard leaseholder. And they mention implications that have arisen from amendments. So, you know, there's all kinds of stakeholders pointing out we've got issues for shared owners with this Act. The Act isn't the only game in town. You've got this really important legal question of whether shared ownership is home ownership, low-cost home ownership, whether it's a long leasehold, or whether it's a tenancy, and then whether it's an assured tenancy or an assured short-hold tenancy. And the somewhat complicated and unhelpful answer is that it's all three or all four, under different laws and in different circumstances, which can cause confusion and frustrated expectations. Shared ownership is frequently described as leasehold, not least in the model lease. And this is the truth, but it's not the whole truth. And a recent court case, Sovereign Network Homes versus Vanessa East, demonstrates why this matters for your own operational purposes, if nothing else. The Renters Reform Bill would have solved some problems by taking shared ownership out of assured tenancy, but that bill was dropped during wash-up. So we've got this ongoing complexity and ambiguity as to the precise legal status of shared ownership and shared owners, which has profound implications for the experience of shared ownership and, of course, for housing associations. Now here I've quoted Justin Bates, who refers to shared ownership as an ongoing legal mess, and to Giles Peaker, who's a well-known housing solicitor who calls for ending the Frankenstein's monster status of the tenure. And I want to make it clear here that what he's calling for is an end to the status of the tenure, not the tenure itself. And I think there's an important distinction to draw out there. There's confusion in law and there's confusion in policy. And to my mind, a great many of the current problems with shared ownership originate in a profound lack of clarity as to what shared ownership is intended to achieve in the 21st century, over and above the oft-repeated slogan of a foot on the housing ladder. Back in 1979, in their manifesto, the Conservative Party introduced shared ownership as a way to progress to full home ownership in instalments. But national monitoring statistics show that that's increasingly unlikely in today's economic environment. So what is shared ownership today? These two screenshots illustrate disparities in how shared ownership is now perceived within the social housing sector. Southern say that shared ownership is a way to stop renting, but Clarion say that it's a mistake to compare shared ownership to full home ownership, and it's more accurate to liken it to private renting. So go figure. And a recent research article from Savills illustrates a different problem. It's titled Why Shared Ownership, and it discusses why investors like shared ownership. And the bottom line here is that investors, rather than shared owners themselves, are increasing the focus for the financial benefits of the scheme. However, there is a real human cost to treating homes as income-generating assets or portfolios. And I've already touched on the human cost in terms of dissatisfaction and large numbers of shared owners trapped in increasingly unaffordable and or unsuitable homes. And it's worth noting that it's the failure of shared owners to staircase to 100% that generates the attractively predictable above inflation returns for investors. So in many respects, you've got a profound conflict of interest between shared owners and other stakeholders. We're a long way from the original intention of the scheme, per that 1979 Conservative Party manifesto, that shared owners progressed to buy the remaining shares. And this is one of the reasons that I suggest that shared ownership is a good idea gone bad. I'm aware of attempts to reposition shared ownership as permanent partial home ownership, but there are problems in this approach, particularly when it comes to long-term shared owners, those approaching or in retirement, and/or for their beneficiaries. So summing up where we got to at this point, at the inception, the policy intention was that households transition to full home ownership, but we're in a very different economic climate now, so perhaps it's more unlikely now. The stats definitely point in that direction. There have been very low rates of staircasing for decades. Affordability is maxed out at the outset, but costs are likely to increase faster than household income, with the proviso, depending what area of the UK you're looking at. I mean, we need to drill down into that, but generally speaking, that is a huge risk. There's a lack of viable exit routes. Some research, I think, thinking outside the box, published by Cash, suggested that back-to-back sales were the norm. But back-to-back sales transition scarce social housing stock to the open market and possibly to the private rental sector, which is a driver for entry to the shared ownership scheme. So possibly there's an unwelcome kind of circular effect there. And I've already mentioned the fact that the cross-subsidy model can create very real conflicts of interest where shared owners' best interests can be subordinated or just overlooked. Okay, how will a new Labour government tackle shared ownership? The answer is, unfortunately, we just don't know yet. But at least some people in the social housing sector have expressed concerns that shared ownership won't be a priority for new Labour government. For example, per this briefing to Inside Housing magazine. But having said that, it's really not clear how the new government would fund social rental housing. So I think shared owners are watching with interest and some concern. What would I want from a new government? I would want a fundamental review of the policy objectives of shared ownership and of the value for money for shared owners over the long term and for the public purse. In the wider affordable housing context, you cannot look at shared ownership in isolation. I would absolutely want to see a reversal of the reliance on the cross-subsidy development model. I would want to see the legal mess fixed. Shared owners should have the same rights and protections as other leaseholders and other home buyers, and they should benefit from joined-up regulation and ombudsman services. The increasing lack of consistency should be addressed, and also the emerging two-tier markets. And by two-tier markets, I'm not just talking about the difference between the new model, the previous model, and iterations before that. There's also an increasing divide between grant-funded homes and homes funded under Section 106 agreements, and perhaps for-profit shared ownership, which is an area that I know less about. I would like to see a government fund viable exit routes, buyback or reverse staircase into social rent, depending on the situation. Somebody might be very happy in their home but not be able to afford it, or they might have a desperate need to leave but not be able to sell it. So we need to look at sort of the different scenarios which trap shared owners in their homes. Finally, what about the sector? It's not all down to the government. It's not just a case of following government instructions or policy and having no view or policy stance on that. Affordability should be designed in at the outset. Some of the issues are kind of unavoidable once a building is constructible. Those high charges were designed in at the outset. Could we not take a IKEA approach to design and affordability at the outset? I'd like to see sectoral bodies step up. I wonder why there were no public responses to the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Committee report. I wonder why there was no public response to the Advertising Standards Authority ruling that the national marketing campaign was misleading in key respects. As I've said already, I wonder why there was no written or oral evidence to the Public Bill Committee scrutinising the draft bill. I'd like to see shared owners have more consumer protection, better consumer protection. I'd like to see the sector stop resorting to caveat emptor. I'd like to see the sector rise to the standards set by the New Homes Quality Board Code, from which shared ownership is currently excluded. And I'd like to see the sector comply with the spirit and the letter of the CAP code for advertising, marketing and promotions. I'd like to see the sector be more vocal on the need to fund viable exit routes where required. And my most important point, I'd like to see the sector commission independent research on long-term outcomes, not on demand, not on recent buyer satisfaction, on long-term outcomes and impact. Who does shared ownership work best for? Who doesn't it work for? I don't think we can answer that question without research. So, I'm frequently asked, what do you think we should do? I don't know. We don't have the data. We don't have the research. I can put ideas out there, but we need robust research and data to target shared ownership where it works best, and not to target it where it's going to have adverse consequences, where it's going to pose significant ongoing life challenges for households that enter the scheme. And, on the question of should we improve it or should we scrap it? Again, I think it's very difficult to answer that without research. I think possibly some aspects of it should be scrapped, or some locations should be scrapped, or some types of property should be scrapped, and some elements of the scheme should be improved. But we really need more information to be able to answer the questions that are posed by low satisfaction. Having said that, there's a great deal of knowledge, information and insight in the sector that's not always accessible to shared owners themselves. So I look forward to an interesting and informative discussion on the points that I've raised in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. I'm going to open up the screen now back to everybody. There we are. Lovely. So, I mean, we've got more than 70 people in the chat, in the room, and the chat has not stopped at all throughout the presentation. So, from personally, a massive thank you to you for the presentation and for, I think, really highlighting some of the key issues on both sides there. If anyone would like to raise or come in at any point, there is a reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. Use that and raise your hand. I'd love to have you come in. This is very much an open forum for anyone to ask or to provide insight. So if you'd like to, please do dive in. Where to start with the chat? Goodness me. I'll try, as always, you can try going back to the beginning, but I think a lot of the points we're agreeing with each other. I think the need for reform is clearly huge. A lot of questions coming in around, or a lot of points being raised really around repairs. That seems to be one of the key parts, which is 100% ownership for repairs, even though you don't own 100% of the property, seem to be a big piece, and that we need some leasehold legislation change there. Amy had mentioned about a new model that had come in, so 500 per year for the first 10 years for repairs and maintenance, and that they're trying to do some work themselves. They've got over 200,000 shared owners as part of the business they work for, but data is key, and they're struggling to get sometimes the replies, which I know you mentioned in some of the reports we're getting for 100 and something people. It's some data, but obviously not all. Apparently the new affordability guidance doesn't use the word maximum anymore, which is interesting based on your one that you mentioned with Clarion, and the point you raised from the tenant who said we kind of had to get to the maximum that we could. And David has mentioned there, successive governments were responsible for some of these problems. What do we think about the government's ability to solve them now? And Amy's point was that they think the work will carry on to reform the product, looking at affordability, etc. For now, I'm going to bring in Jim. Jim, do please dive in. Lovely to hear from you today. This episode of the Social Housing Roundtable is sponsored by Alertical. Alertical helps as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. Alertical's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Calls, an easier, simpler and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare and smoke alarms. Alertical works with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and landlords. In 2022, Alertical won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023 won Housing Supplier of the Year. I'm delighted to have them as our sponsor of the Social Housing Roundtable throughout 2024.
Good morning, everybody. What crosses my mind is that with shared ownership and leaseholdings, how much is put onto them in terms of when you're looking at charges, you know, the charges for community charges and things like this, and how housing associations particularly seem so reliant on the funds coming from them to structure themselves. So should it not be a little more leveler for people who are in shared ownership, and you know, make it worth the while to be involved as a shared owner? That's speaking as a tenant who is, you know, on benefits and gets my housing benefit. But I feel the community charges and the service charges may be a little more fairer towards shared ownership. That's only, you know, just a view.
So what are your thoughts on that? What's your insight from the people you've worked with?
Sorry, I'm afraid I was looking at the chat and I slightly got distracted at the beginning of the question. Look at the question's already been asked. Could I ask just for a quick...
Yeah, Jim, do you want to repeat that one? Jim, you're on mute, pal.
Sorry, Jim.
Jim, you're on mute. Jim, you're on mute.
Sorry, do you feel that people who are you know, getting involved with shared ownership as customers and the like should be given a little more of a fairer playing field in service charges and things like this? You know, where if you're on benefits, you may pay a community charge, but in comparison, I think housing associations are becoming more dependent on the, you know, monies coming in from shared ownerships and leaseholds.
Yeah, good question. Service charge is such a huge question. Some of the issues overlap with leasehold issues. Obviously, the issue of high service charges in complex development. So let's just kind of acknowledge that and put it to one side. I think what is of most interest to me in terms of the affordability of ongoing service charges and the fairness of them is that the scheme assesses people in terms of what proportion of their income it's reasonable to take as total housing costs. And the scheme takes 40 to 45% as guidance, not as a fixed threshold, but as guidance. And in that context, firstly, I would say the Affordability Housing Commission some years ago suggested that anything above 30% signals a serious affordability problem. So we're bringing people in at a high cost to income ratio. And then what happens after that is that you've got, first of all, this sort of inflation plus rent increase. You've also got service charges that, and again, let's make the proviso, here I'm talking more about flats than houses. Houses may have issues with estate charges, whatever the makeup of the housing costs. The key point is that if they continue to rise faster than income, so that people are paying more than 40 to 45% of their income on housing costs, then people are going to feel that that aspiration of affordable housing is not borne out by the reality. I'm going to add one more point here, because I think this is something that the updated Homes England guidance attempts to tackle. A cost to income ratio is a blunt tool. It's useful, but say you're coming in as an individual with a 90k salary, even after high housing costs, the likelihood is you're going to have a lot more disposable income after housing costs than a household that's coming in on a low salary. So I come back to the need for data. For whom do housing costs rise above the ratios that the guidelines determine as being the maximum possible?
Really, really interesting. And I think it's maybe therein lies the biggest debate of all. I'm going to go, is Amy Nettleton still with us, or is she left? Hopefully she'll come back. Kelly, I'm going to go to yourself first then. You were next in line. Thank you.
Okay, just in response to that, Sue. So the first thing to be really clear about is that the guidance has updated, it has changed, and the wording around affordability has changed. But the really interesting thing is what you're talking about in the 30% versus the 40 to 45 is exactly the same figure. What has always been misunderstood by campaigners and people that look at it is that the calculation to get to that figure was a very different figure. So you can't compare the two and say one is bad and one is good. They are technically the same thing. So the other thing that's really important to know is that customers were not maxed out. The word maximum was used, absolutely, and it was just badly placed. The word maximum is a horrible word to use when we talk about affordability. So that maximum has been removed. But that affordability calculation was always done with the customer's circumstances in mind, but also considering what the lender would lend. So if we're going to look at affordability and say that things weren't worked out properly, or they shouldn't have been allowed, then lenders need to be pulled into this conversation too, because lenders are always aware of the costs. They're always aware of everything that's done. And you would argue that a lender should know, that's kind of just their job. They should know what is and isn't affordable, because they know about the forward costs too. They deal with leasehold all the time. Shared ownership has all of the aspects of leasehold that a normal non-shared owner has, with the rent in there too. So I think that to compare the two and to say that the 40 to 45% is awful compared to the 30, different. We're talking kilometres and miles per hour. You've got to look at them that way. You're doing the same thing. It's just the measure is slightly different. So just for balance, I think that's an important thing that we should bear in mind. So the new calculation that has been done within the capital funding guide now is more sympathetic to the other ways of calculating affordability. So we're using the same measures so that when we're looking at outcomes, you can then align it with the 30% that has been discussed previously. And the outcome, when you look at it as a whole, is largely the same. So that argument of the 30 is valid, but I think it's a misunderstanding from the old calculation to the new.
Thank you. I mean, it's helpful to understand the relationship. Well, it's helpful to know more about the relationship between the Affordable Housing Commission statistic of 30% and the guidance in initial affordability assessments. I think, again, we come back to lack of data about long-term outcomes, because regardless of the sort of relationship between those two ratios at the point of entry, the key point is, however that ratio is determined, or whatever really is the maximum, and obviously that varies on, you know, disposable income, all kinds of things, is whether costs start affordable and become unaffordable over time. And what I would suggest is the little evidence that we have, and I'm thinking about research by the Joseph Flantry Foundation, research by Sheffield Hallam University, research by the University of York. The independent research tends to suggest that shared owners find total housing, shared owners, I mean, please, every time I use the term shared owners, please take it as read that I don't mean every single shared owner, but that a significant number, and we don't know whether majority or minority because we don't have that data, but, you know, a significant number of shared owners who should not be overlooked and who may indicate a trend in a change in economic climate. You know, they may be like the thin edge of the wedge, a wedge that's going to get wide. We should not be overlooking the people who have problems. And so there's research that suggests, and the responses to the Levelling Up Housing Communities Committee, not only that costs become affordable, but give some insight into why. I mean, shared owners have a lot of insight into how their costs have increased. And I think the University of York research is coming back to designing affordability in. University of York research found that service charges tended to go up. And again, we're talking about consolidated averages, but, you know, they could go up. They tended to go up faster than inflation. So again, this is because properties don't need repairs and maintenance during the 10-year initial period, whatever. When's your lift going to need doing? Your roof, the communal green spaces. Some of them within that first year, I mean, unarguably, some people find their costs go up very quickly, very rapidly, but it's inherent in the nature of some of these developments that costs will jump at some point. And I'm not sure that either housing associations or lenders or the government look ahead, which in the context of the fact that mortgage terms are very rarely 25 years now. People are increasingly taking out 30, 35-year mortgages. That seems, I know you can't predict the future, but to have some sense of whether the model lends itself towards ongoing financial sustainability seems to me to be a fairly basic premise for something that is delivered under an affordable homes programme and markets itself as affordable. So regardless of discussion... I'm
going to go back to Kelly, because we've got a number of people that are diving in. I'm going to go back to Kelly because I saw you come off, so I thought Kelly might have a response. Then I was going to Amy and then Floris, Neil, David. But Kelly, over to you.
I think your everything you say is valid, Sue, and there are examples of everything that you're saying. But I think that the language that we use is really concerning. It's not that we shouldn't be concerned about the few, but you said we have no data. I don't know the numbers of data, but it's a significant amount. How do you quantify that?
What I would say is that the government's data focuses on completions. Staircasing data has conflated staircasing to 100% by a shared owner who lives in that property with back-to-back sales. There is no national government data on ongoing affordability. Now, that would be hard to collect. You get into freedom of information issues. So in terms of data about affordability, what I'm really saying there is this isn't collected nationally, but the pieces of independent research that we have strongly point in the direction of significant numbers of shared owners experiencing poor value for money and affordability issues over the long term. And this is really
the challenge there is always going to be, I mean, you've already pointed out some of, and this is not me disagreeing with either Kelly or Sue. I think playing in the middle, you've got low numbers, as we've discussed, but also those who maybe are going to respond, or sometimes those who are the least satisfied. So it's the balance between the two is going to be, not that I'm disagreeing with you at all, Sue. Like you say, the numbers are indicating that, but until we get, as you've pointed out, and I love the point that you said, what we need is more data. Till we get those numbers, it's hard, but at the moment it seems to be leaning one way. But it means that both arguments are completely valid. Kelly, if you're still with us, I'm going to bring you in. Sorry, not
Amy.
Kelly. Sorry, Amy. Sorry, Amy.
Yeah, I am. Sorry. Yeah, thanks, Matt, and again, Sue, for your presentation, and Kelly's brought us up to speed on the affordability side of things. I think what we need to bear in mind here, and the product has undergone reform over the past probably 2 or 3 years, the most it's seen in a 40-year period. So it is certainly open to change, and we are certainly wanting that to change. I think the key things here around satisfaction and stuff is, are we asking the right questions? Okay. And a lot of organisations will ask specific questions that shared owners can relate to and give their own satisfaction measures. Like I put in the chat and you responded, Sue, we don't ask a shared owner if they're satisfied with repairs, because up until the new funding round, we don't do their repairs. So of course they're going to say no. So we need to make sure what we're asking is relevant to the client base of what we're providing. I also think, and as much as I am a very, positive advocate of the 10-year, I also very much agree that it's not without its problems, and one that we work tirelessly to really try and get some rich kind of analysis around. But I do think the question has to boil down to, and you said it yourself, Sue, you've got all of this stuff, but you've not got any answers. You don't know what to do. Okay. And I think a lot of it around of, capping service charges, reducing rents, all of these things, who's paying for this? And this is the key point here, because we've had many discussions around, okay, that'd be great. Let's share the burden within a related prorated share basis. One of the reasons why shared ownership starts off at a subsidised rent is because we don't do repairs and maintenance, and we don't do all of those other things. Therefore, why there's a grant now for the increased repairs and maintenance in the new model. So where would that money come from? Where would the money come from capping service charges? What is the outcome we want here? Is it the outcome that we want to reduce delivery? Is the outcome that we want to actually stop building as much as we need to build? Or do we actually need to look at what the systemic issues are, and at what point does something become a pinch point for a shared owner that actually the product of old maybe needs renewing and looking at? And where is that funding coming from? How do businesses plan for that funding? And like you said, Sue, you said providers don't think about long-term costs. How do you think we financially plan as a business? We financially plan 10 to 15 years, 5, 10, 15 years ahead. We don't financially plan the year that we're in. And equally, going back to some other points as well around, this obsession with staircasing and moving out. I think a lot of comments and meetings that I've been on recently of people going, oh, well, shared owners are trapped. They just want to get out, and they're thinking of moving on as soon as they're moving in. We've actually lost the fundamental part of why we are all here and why we have this so close to our hearts. We are building people's homes. These are people's homes that they are moving into. And I don't know about you, but whenever you moved into whatever tenure, and I know, Sue, you were a shared owner that you successfully sold and on a buy-to-let mortgage. So that's a great situation for yourself. But I think the thing that we've lost here is that we don't always think about when we move into a home of when we're going to move out of it. And yes, a large proportion of shared owners will want to buy a bit more and they will want to own their home on the outright, on the open market. But a lot of shared owners actually just want some safety and security and don't want to go into the private rented sector. And we actually now ask the question, I've put in the chat, and I'm happy to share this with you, Matt, afterwards, with some data and stuff that we're collecting specifically at Astor around, that's the dog, so around when shared owners are looking to buy shared ownership, what are they wanting to get from it? Do they want to buy a bit more, or is it just another reason? And those stats are quite compelling. And not to continue to go on, Matt, but they're just a few of my highlights, and I'm happy to share any data or thoughts that we're working on offline with you, that you could then share out. But I know Nick, Floris, and Ian now, and David all want to come in. So
no, thank you.
I'll shut up.
No, thank you. So I will let you quickly dive back in because I want to point towards yourself there. No, I'm good for. So 30 seconds, and we can go to Floris.
I'll try and be brief. First of all, I didn't sell my flat under a buy-to-let mortgage. I haven't sold my flat. I still have it. I don't live in it. I just, on a personal note, I want to, it's a semantic thing. I don't say I don't have any answers. I say I don't have the answers. I think the answers will come out of involving shared owners in discussions about aspirations and expectations in a way that I think doesn't happen at the moment, and in co-designing research so that it takes the expertise and lived experience of shared owners on board in determining the parameters for research and analysis. So what I do welcome are radical proposals within the sector. So I think, it's interesting, Matthew Bales, am I pronouncing his surname right, of Paradigm Housing, recently raised the question of whether we should consider staircasing at original market value. It's an interesting question. Is it the answer? Don't know. I mean, you'd have to debate it. But I think what I also want to try and
I'll come back to you, Sue, if there's another point. I'm going to go to Floris. We've got people waiting. Floris, do please dive in. Over to you.
I'm going to be quick, otherwise.
All good.
But thank you very much, Sue, again. Obviously, always insightful as ever. I'm going to bring up two things, one that I agree with you on and one that I don't agree with you on. The one that I do agree with you on is the fact that I think we've lost a sense of who shared ownership is actually for. And I think it's really important that we try and figure that out. I think in our head, when I started my business, I thought the shared ownership was a stopgap between sort of generation rent and bank of mum and dad. Obviously, there's a huge group of people there, and we need to try and pinpoint exactly, what kind of background these people need to have for shared ownership to work. We've looked at a lot of the data, and the alternative for these people would have been renting at a rental yield which is much higher than what shared ownership is at. The only reason why their housing cost might be more expensive is that they've got a mortgage, which is exactly what they wanted. So I think at least they're building some equity. The sort of interesting data that we found was that for you to be able to get into shared ownership, you can be an average person across all geographies in the UK. For you to be able to staircase to 100%, you had to be quite a bit above average in terms of your income. And London's a fascinating one because actually the average salary that you need to staircase to 100% is above what the maximum allowed income is for shared ownership. And we'll delve into the numbers a bit better tomorrow. But I think on this point, to me, instead of us coming up with suggestions around what we could do to improve the tenure, we should probably talk about suggestions on how we can collect the right data so that we can then come up with data-backed solutions rather than speculating. Because if we scrap shared ownership and said, fine, let's do something completely new, it would take 10 years for us to figure out what's wrong with the new tenure. So that's, on point number one. The one that I disagree with you on is the conflict of interest between housing association and residents. As Amy pointed out, I mean, it's not free money that housing associations have. A lot of the revenue that comes in is used to build new homes. On staircasing specifically, whilst there are some pension funds that are getting into shared ownership who do rely on long-term inflation-linked income, the majority of financial directors that we speak to at the G15 are all not-for-profit, actually love staircasing because it releases equity that they can then plug back into the system to build more homes. And that's something that we heard from them firsthand. Now, not everyone can staircase, not everyone wants to staircase, but I don't think there's a conflict of interest between the resident wanting or needing to staircase and the housing association. But welcome your thoughts.
No, thank you, Floris. I really appreciate it. So we'll come back to you. Jot a couple of notes down. I want to make sure we're hearing from everybody too. So Neil, I'm going to go to you next.
Thanks. I think that the first thing to note is in the chat, Becky Ryder just made a lot of points that I was going to make in terms of the key issues that sit within shared ownership, particularly around it being a leasehold and the impact of service charges. I mean, just on a personal note, I've got a cousin who is being forced to sell their apartment in Greenwich because their service charge has gone up 300 to 400 quid per month and they can no longer stay in the property. So it's just a personal example there of some of the issues and the impacts that you have on those additional costs that ramp up once you're in the property. They're not necessarily shared ownership specific, but they are problematic for shared owners. On broader points around affordability, there's a very simple way that we do this, and you just expand out the TSMs that are in place at the moment to include rent arrears and have that split down across LCRA and LCHO. The volume in terms of a percentage and a cash value will actually give you quite a good indication as to where there are problems in relation to affordability for shared owners. I always see shared ownership as the canary in the gold mine for identifying problems with your customer base. They are by the very definition excluded from traditional market products and therefore susceptible to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune of the economy. So they are a very good barometer for understanding where there is pain. London's a bizarre market because it is such high demand, and you'll always see greater levels there in terms of percentage and cash values of arrears. It's just the nature of the beast. But fundamentally what you are seeing for shared owners is where it's unaffordable to live for general population, it is unaffordable for shared owners for exactly the same reasons. You are protected a little bit with the subsidised rents, but you are wholly open to market value when it comes to everything else. And that is a problem when your income is not necessarily and even deliberately, because of the affordability criteria attached to these products, at the whims of the market. So just elements there to point. I think long term in terms of reform, I don't know what's going to happen. I think it's a pain in the ass that we now have 3 different models in place for shared owners. I think it's an absolute crime that we haven't retrospectively applied the new model lease to the old ones. Logistical problems there aside, I think for housing associations that's going to be a pain to manage moving forward. But again, for business plans, we try and operate 10 to 15 years ahead. Governments have traditionally operated 5 years. And that's built in a whole load of problems for the sector more generally. Appreciate your time, so I'll shut up.
No problem at all. I mean, Neil raised there the Becca's point, which came up in the chat. Like I say, a lot of the issues with SO are issues with leasehold and service charges. Savills report highlights that Homes England data indicates over 72% of shared ownership homes outside of London are houses or bungalows, which typically have minimal service charges. So it'll be interesting to see what Labour do around existing shared options, given any reform will have an impact on finances of housing associations, and what will Labour's plans around abolishing leasehold for common hold mean for the sector. David, I'm going to bring you in.
Yeah, thanks very much, Matt, and thank you, Sue. What you do is really important for our sector. There aren't enough voices like yours around. I may not necessarily agree with all of the conclusions that you come to, or even necessarily the prescriptions, but it's important what you do. I also wanted to acknowledge the typically impassioned, as I would have expected, defence of the shared ownership model by housing associations that we heard from Amy. But Sue, you posed a really key question, and there is actually an elephant in the room question that follows on from your question: has shared ownership gone bad? And I want to put this out there, because if in actual fact shared ownership has gone bad, then my question would be, have registered housing providers been responsible for mis-selling the shared ownership products? I've said that very slowly so that everyone can hear clearly the question that I have asked. And as someone who's been around in the sector for 30 years and was involved in shared ownership, both development and sales, more or less from the first moment I entered the sector, I was involved with Northcote Housing Association in West London in the early 1990s. We were very clear, those of us who had specialist shared ownership associations back in the day, we were very clear at the time what we were doing, who the product was for, how it was being offered, and how it was being explained. And there are all kinds of reasons, much of which has been mentioned in the chat, as to why it has maybe gone off the rails in the meantime. And I would contend that there are things that have gone wrong, and undoubtedly there are individuals who are suffering from the things that have gone wrong. But have they gone badly wrong? Well, if they've gone so badly wrong, then that would suggest that some other action needs to be taken. I've not seen any ambulance chasing lawyers, not Giles Peaker, not anybody else out there, as far as I can see, lining up to raise mis-selling claims or complaints against housing providers. And I think it's really important as we move forward and we take on board the things that undoubtedly need to be fixed. And yes, we hope that the government will intervene usefully and productively, perhaps more so than previous governments have, in the field of first-time buyers and starter homes and so on. Let's be sure that we're debating this on the right terms. Thank you.
Agreed. No, thank you, David. Ian, I'm going to come to yourself. Sue, I know you're desperate to come back. We've got about 2 minutes. I want to make sure we're hearing from everyone who's got their hand up if we can. But Ian, over to you.
Yeah, hi. I just want to say, as a specialist mortgage broker in the sector, shared ownership is in general a good product because it gives clients a choice that they wouldn't have otherwise. Whether that choice is to buy or not buy, whether it's to move to an area they want to live in or live in an area that they don't want to be in, is a different thing. But one of my frustrations when we talk about staircasing to 100% and judging the product by it, why is it any different if somebody staircases to 100% and has a mortgage on the property to if they sell their share and buy on the open market? Either way, they end up with the property and a mortgage. The majority of my clients will move and buy a property, and that to me is as successful as somebody staircasing to 100%. And I don't understand why, if we are insistent on judging it on staircasing returns, why do we only look on if you stay in the property that you originally bought? I don't understand.
I will come back to you soon. I'm going to go to Tony and then I'll come to you. I'm very well. We've got 1.5 minutes left and people having to go because of time. So Tony, I'll go to you first.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Very quickly, I thought that was really helpful, Sue. Really good challenge. I want to concentrate on the sort of bigger picture issues because I think we can go down rabbit holes if we're not careful. I think we've got the existing estates, the existing shared owners, and I think we really need to focus on them. And I think as a sector, we are not consistent in terms of how we operate. And I think we need to do much more in this space. And I'm picking up on Sue's point earlier about how we engage with our shared owners and how they really influence the service they get and their requirements. And I don't think we are transparent enough. I don't think we approach this in treating them as adults and having a sort of partnership approach. And I think we as housing associations, there's a lot of context as to why we got here, and I don't think we are the villains, but I do think we have obligations, and how we help people exit and support people on the way is something critical that collectively we need to do. I also think we need to influence a new model of shared ownership because I think there will be a requirement, and I think we will have an opportunity with the new government. And I think the call to action for us is how we join up with all of the wider stakeholders, obviously including those customers. And I'll declare my interest not only as a home ownership director for Sovereign, but my oldest son is a school teacher and a shared owner who would like to staircase and ultimately own outright. So I think the call to action is for all of these interested parties to focus our energy going forward and take the opportunity to try and influence, and also take responsibility as much as we can about unpicking the challenges that the sector has for our existing customers.
I completely agree. And Ian and Tony, thank you. James, I've asked you to put your point in the chat because we'd love to hear it, but we're out of time. I mean, as Richard has said there, so we could have put a whole day in for this one and debated it all day. But what are your thoughts on some of the things you've heard, and how would you like to close off today? I'll pass over to you as someone who's obviously brought the subject to the table today.
So much to tackle, and honestly, it's like, as I said at the beginning, I can't get across the nuance in such a short time, and I think that's reflected in the discussions. I focused on 100% staircasing because I was looking at the good idea in 1979 and how far we've moved from it. In my report, Shared Ownership, the Consumer Perspective, what I talk about there is both aspects of getting to full ownership via a gain on sale and via staircasing to 100%. So I discussed both of those routes in that report, and I would signpost people in the direction of that report for a more detailed analysis of both of those routes and how they relate to each other. Because what's really fascinating there is if the market supports staircasing, it's not conducive to a gain on sale and vice versa. So we come back again to what's the ultimate objective, or are you really at the whim of the market? I also really want to touch on the cross-subsidy model. Yes, there are huge questions about how we fund housing, not just affordable housing, any housing, rental housing. What I strongly disagree with is the idea that the cross-subsidy model should sit on a demographic that by definition is financially vulnerable compared to other households. That seems to me to be the wrong approach, the wrong underlying driver for the cross-subsidy model. And I'm saying this with my tongue in my cheek. I know you can't do this, but why don't you sit on mansions to millionaires? I mean, why does the cross-subsidy model sit on financially vulnerable households? So yes, how do we fund social housing? It's a huge question. I put my hands up and say, I do not have the answer to that one. I don't have all the answers. I see my role more as posing challenging questions that I hope try and understand why you've got such critical media coverage and why you've got low dissatisfaction ratings. And I have some thoughts. I don't have the answers. We need to push a new government to go in a direction that is more satisfactory to providers and beneficiaries of housing, affordable, shared ownership, rental, whatever. We need better housing solutions. It's a huge, huge, huge question. And to my mind, it's not high enough up the political agenda.
I really appreciate it. Someone's asked whether or not I can save the chat because it's been absolutely wild today, almost a whole hour unto itself would just be reading through that. So I'll absolutely do that and share that to anyone who wishes. Thank you to Sue. Thank you to everyone who provided insight today. I think it was Natasha who said, really great discussion, very balanced. And I think that was the joy of today, was it needed to be, you know, quite diverse in thought and quite diverse in mind. And I like that people have agreed respectfully. So thank you to everybody who has agreed, disagreed, shared thoughts, shared ideas. I really appreciate it. Thank you to you, Sue, for today. The recording will go live soon. And I'll see you all at a future social housing roundtable next Tuesday. And I was trying to see if I could pull up in time what it would be. It's going to be on retrofit. So who knows? Not something nice and non-contentious. So that'll be with Eleanor Bowden. But until then, Sue, thank you. And thank you to the 70+ people who joined us today. It's been brilliant. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.